TSA Officer Raymond Hayes had been at Baltimore-Washington International Airport for 9 years when he made a decision that would end his career, cost the Department of Homeland Security $9.4 million, and expose a pattern of racial profiling so blatant that even his own supervisors couldn't defend it. He was 42 years old, experienced enough to recognize federal credentials, old enough to understand the consequences of wrongful arrest, but apparently convinced that his instincts about who looked suspicious were more reliable than actual identification documents. One Friday afternoon at BWI Airport, he received a vague alert about a suspicious black male in Terminal D and immediately locked onto Marcus Thornton, the Deputy Director of the Office of Intelligence and Analysis for the very department Hayes worked under. What Hayes did next, ignoring federal identification, dismissing supervisor warnings, and arresting a senior DHS official in front of hundreds of travelers, would become proof that racial profiling operates even within the agencies designed to prevent it. A black man in his late 40s, Marcus Thornton, was standing in the TSA pre-check line at BWI Airport, laptop bag over his shoulder, boarding pass in hand. His Department of Homeland Security credentials were visible on the lanyard around his neck. No threat, no violation, no disturbance. Just a senior federal official catching a flight to a counterterrorism briefing in D.C. But Officer Hayes saw him through a filter, so distorted by assumptions about who looks dangerous that he couldn't process a black man in a business suit as someone who literally helped design the security protocols Hayes was supposed to follow. Before we continue, where are you watching from? If this is your first time here, please hit that subscribe button. Stories like these need to be shared, and your support helps us bring more truth to light. Baltimore-Washington International Thurgood Marshall Airport sits 10 miles south of Baltimore, handling over 27 million passengers every year. Terminal D is the Southwest Airlines terminal, a sprawling space of ticketing counters, security checkpoints, and gate areas that stays packed from 5 a.m. until midnight. The security checkpoint in Terminal D processes thousands of travelers daily. Business people in suits, families with strollers, college students with backpacks, elderly passengers in wheelchairs. It's the kind of place where every demographic imaginable passes through metal detectors and body scanners, removing shoes and belts, placing laptops in gray bins, trying to catch flights on time. It was 3:45 p.m. on a Friday in October. The afternoon rush was building. Terminal D's security lines stretched back toward the ticketing counters. Business people checked their watches, anxious about making their flights. Families corralled children. The air smelled like coffee from the Starbucks near the checkpoint and cleaning solution from the floors. Overhead, announcements echoed through the terminal every few minutes. Gate changes, boarding calls, security reminders. The TSA checkpoint had 6 lanes operating. Officers in blue uniforms monitored X-ray screens, directed passengers through body scanners, and checked IDs at the document verification stations. The pre-check lane, reserved for trusted travelers and federal employees, moved faster than the standard lanes. Travelers in pre-check kept their shoes and belts on, left their laptops in their bags, walked through metal detectors instead of the more intrusive body scanners. It was the kind of Friday afternoon where nothing dramatic typically happens. Routine screenings, occasional bag searches, a forgotten water bottle here, a confiscated pocket knife there. The steady rhythm of airport security performing exactly as designed. Marcus Thornton had been with the Department of Homeland Security for 18 years. 18 years working in counterterrorism, intelligence analysis, and threat assessment that required the kind of precision and judgment most people never develop. He'd spent 12 years at the Office of Intelligence and Analysis, starting as a senior intelligence officer analyzing terrorist financing networks. In that role, he'd tracked money moving through shell corporations in Dubai, identified patterns in Hawala transfers that funded operations in Afghanistan, and coordinated with Treasury Department investigators to freeze accounts linked to terrorist organizations. Then he'd moved into leadership roles that put him in charge of coordinating intelligence sharing between DHS and the FBI, CIA, and NSA, work that required navigating bureaucratic turf battles while ensuring that critical intelligence reached the analysts who needed it. For the past 6 years, he'd served as Deputy Director of the Office of Intelligence and Analysis. overseeing a team of 320 analysts responsible for assessing threats to the homeland. He'd briefed cabinet secretaries on evolving threats from foreign terrorist organizations and domestic extremist groups. He'd testified before congressional committees in closed sessions about intelligence gaps and resource needs. He'd coordinated responses to credible terrorist threats that never made headlines because his team prevented them. Suspicious travelers identified before they boarded planes. Financing networks disrupted before they could fund operations. Plots uncovered through intelligence analysis that connected fragments of information into actionable intelligence. His work had taken him to secure facilities most Americans never knew existed. The National Counterterrorism Center in McLean, Virginia, where analysts from 16 intelligence agencies worked side by side. The FBI's Strategic Information and Operations Center, where he'd briefed directors on emerging threats. And secure conference rooms in the White House, where he'd participated in National Security Council discussions about terrorism policy. His colleagues called him methodical. His staff called him the person who saw connections others missed. His supervisors called him indispensable. Marcus Thornton had graduated from Howard University with a degree in international relations, where he'd written his senior thesis on the failures of intelligence sharing that preceded the September 11th attacks. That thesis had earned him a recommendation from his advisor for a position at the newly created Department of Homeland Security. He'd then earned a master's in security studies from Georgetown's Walsh School of Foreign Service, where he'd studied under former CIA officers and diplomats who taught him how intelligence analysis shapes policy decisions. He'd completed executive training at the National Defense University's College of International Security Affairs, where he'd studied asymmetric warfare and intelligence operations with military officers and intelligence professionals from allied nations. He'd received the Secretary's Award for Excellence twice, once for his work disrupting a terrorist financing network in 2014 that had been funneling money to ISIS-affiliated groups in Iraq, and again for his leadership during the COVID-19 pandemic's security implications, when he'd coordinated intelligence assessments about potential attacks on vaccine distribution sites and threats against public health officials. The intelligence community recognized him as one of the most respected voices in counterterrorism analysis. When other agencies needed someone who could brief political appointees without overselling intelligence or inject analysis into policy debates without overstepping boundaries, they called Marcus Thornton. At 48 years old, Marcus Thornton was exactly where he'd worked to be, trusted by both political appointees who came and went with administrations and career intelligence professionals who provided continuity across decades. He was respected across agencies in an intelligence community known for turf battles and competing priorities. And he'd been given responsibility for some of the most sensitive intelligence operations in the country, work that required security clearances that took years to obtain and maintain. He had 2 daughters in college, one at Spelman studying political science, the other at Yale studying computer science. He had a wife, Dr. Angela Thornton, who taught political science at Johns Hopkins and specialized in civil rights history. And he had a home in Bethesda, where he spent weekends coaching youth basketball at the local community center and reading intelligence reports that couldn't leave his secure office, but followed him home in his thoughts about threats that most Americans slept through without ever knowing existed. That Friday afternoon, Thornton had taken the Amtrak Acela from Washington's Union Station to BWI Airport. He was scheduled to catch a 5:15 p.m. Southwest flight back to Reagan National after attending a morning intelligence briefing in Baltimore with FBI field office leadership. The briefing had covered a joint investigation into a suspected homegrown extremist with ties to accelerationist groups, the kind of case that required coordination between federal agencies and careful handling of civil liberties concerns. He'd arrived at Terminal D at 3:30 p.m., printed his boarding pass at the Southwest kiosk, and headed to the TSA checkpoint with 90 minutes before his flight. Plenty of time for someone with pre-check who'd made this trip dozens of times before. He wore a navy blue suit from Brooks Brothers, a white dress shirt, and a burgundy tie. His DHS credentials hung on a lanyard around his neck, the kind with his photo, full name, and title clearly visible. Marcus A. Thornton, Deputy Director, Office of Intelligence and Analysis, U.S. Department of Homeland Security. The credential had a holographic seal, a chip embedded in the card, and a design that every TSA officer was trained to recognize. His laptop bag, a black leather case from Toomey, contained his work computer with full disk encryption, briefing materials classified at the secret level that he'd need to return to his secure office, and a printed copy of that day's president's daily brief that he'd reviewed between meetings. His service weapon, a Glock 19 that he was authorized to carry as a senior law enforcement official, was locked in his office safe in the DHS headquarters building in Washington. He rarely traveled armed unless the situation required it, or he was traveling to facilities where armed protection was expected. He looked like what he was, a senior federal official traveling for work on a routine Friday afternoon. He'd done this exact trip dozens of times over the years. He had TSA pre-check, expedited screening that recognized him as a trusted traveler. He had global entry, which allowed him to skip immigration lines when returning from international travel. He had security clearances that had required background investigations by federal agents who'd interviewed neighbors, colleagues, and references going back decades. He had every credential and clearance the federal government could issue. But to one person monitoring Terminal D that afternoon, Marcus Thornton's presence wasn't routine. It was suspicious, and that person had already decided to do something about it. Raymond Hayes was 42 years old. He'd been a TSA officer at BWI Airport for 9 years, assigned primarily to Terminal D's security checkpoint. Before TSA, he'd worked as a security guard at a shopping mall and spent 2 years in the Army Reserve. He was experienced, thorough, and deeply convinced that his ability to spot suspicious behavior was what kept the airport safe. His supervisors described him as hyper-vigilant, results-oriented, but sometimes lacking in cultural sensitivity. In 9 years, Raymond Hayes had compiled a record that should have raised red flags at every level of supervision. 14 complaints. 14? 10 of them involved allegations of racial profiling or discriminatory treatment of passengers of color. 4 had been sustained, resulting in written reprimands and mandatory implicit bias training. The other 10 had been closed with insufficient evidence or findings of no policy violation, despite passenger statements and witness accounts. Hayes had a pattern. He flagged passengers of color for additional screening at rates significantly higher than white passengers. A black businessman traveling to Atlanta for a conference was subjected to an invasive pat-down after Hayes claimed he detected nervousness. An Indian family traveling to visit relatives was pulled aside for additional questioning about their travel plans. A Hispanic woman flying to her sister's wedding had her bag searched 3 times because Hayes insisted her behavior seemed evasive. An African couple traveling with their children was detained for 90 minutes after Hayes reported them as suspicious despite having valid passports and visas. The pattern was clear. The documentation was extensive, but somehow Hayes remained at his post. His supervisors noted in evaluations that he should work on community engagement and cultural awareness, but those notes never translated into meaningful consequences or assignment changes. TSA leadership treated each complaint in isolation, never connecting them into the pattern they clearly formed. That Friday afternoon at 3:38 p.m., Hayes received an alert over the TSA radio frequency. Be on the lookout for a suspicious black male, approximately 6 feet tall, wearing a business suit, seen loitering near the security checkpoint. The alert came from another TSA officer who'd noticed someone watching the checkpoint for several minutes. In Hayes's mind, the profile immediately locked in. Black male, business attire, watching security procedures, potential threat, possible surveillance. Could be casing the checkpoint for a later attack. Hayes didn't consider that hundreds of people stand near security checkpoints every day, waiting for family members or watching the line to see how long it is. He didn't think about the fact that the description fit dozens of travelers in the terminal. He didn't verify who had issued the alert or what specific behavior had been observed. He just scanned the checkpoint, looking for someone who matched that description. At 3:44 p.m., Marcus Thornton approached the TSA pre-check lane, credentials visible, boarding pass in hand. Hayes saw him immediately. Black male, approximately 6 feet tall, navy suit, near the security checkpoint. In Hayes's mind, that was the threat. He keyed his radio. Target identified. Approaching now. Do you think TSA officers should face automatic termination after their 5th sustained complaint for racial profiling? Drop your answer below. Thornton was placing his laptop bag on the conveyor belt when he became aware of someone approaching him quickly from the side. He looked up and saw a TSA officer, hand on his radio, eyes locked on him, with an expression Thornton had seen before, the look of someone who'd already decided he was guilty of something. "Sir, step aside. Now." Thornton straightened, confused. He glanced at the other travelers in the pre-check line, then back at Hayes. "I'm sorry, I'm just going through security." Hayes moved closer, positioning himself between Thornton and the metal detector. His voice was sharp, authoritative, loud enough that people in adjacent lanes turned to look. "We've received reports of suspicious behavior. You need to come with me. Right now." Thornton felt the familiar weight in his chest, the recognition of what was happening. He kept his voice calm, professional. "Suspicious behavior? I showed my boarding pass at the document check. I placed my bag on the belt. I'm going through the scanner. What's suspicious about that?" Hayes' eyes narrowed. "Don't make this difficult. We have the right to detain anyone exhibiting suspicious behavior. Step aside, or you'll be detained." Thornton reached for the lanyard around his neck, holding up his DHS credentials so Hayes could see them clearly. The badge was visible. The photo matched. The title, Deputy Director, Office of Intelligence and Analysis, was right there in bold letters. "Officer, I'm Director Marcus Thornton, Department of Homeland Security. This is my department. I'm traveling on official business. These are my federal credentials." Hayes glanced at the credentials for less than a second. His expression didn't change. His tone didn't soften. "I don't care if you're the director of NASA. You fit the description we received. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." The TSA checkpoint had gone quiet. Travelers in the pre-check line stopped moving. People in adjacent lanes pulled out their phones. A woman near the document check station called out, "He just showed you his ID. That's a federal badge." Hayes ignored her. He reached for Thornton's arm. This is where bias becomes impenetrable. When someone has decided you're guilty, evidence doesn't matter. Credentials don't matter. The truth doesn't change their mind because they've already constructed a narrative where you're the threat. Hayes had been trained to verify identification. He'd been instructed to recognize federal badges. He'd worked under DHS oversight for 9 years. But in that moment, looking at a black man in a suit, Hayes couldn't process the possibility that this was someone he was supposed to protect, not detain. Thornton pulled his arm back, his voice firm but still controlled. "Officer, do not touch me. I am showing you federal identification. You can verify my credentials with one phone call to the DHS Operations Center. The number is on this badge. Call it." Hayes' jaw clenched. He keyed his radio. "I need backup at Terminal D checkpoint. Suspect refusing to comply." "Suspect?" Thornton's voice rose slightly, the first crack in his professional composure. "I'm not a suspect. I'm a senior federal official. I've shown you my credentials. What is your name and badge number?" Hayes grabbed Thornton's wrist. "Turn around, now!" Other TSA officers were approaching. A supervisor, a woman in her 50s named Patricia Vega, pushed through the crowd. Her voice cut through the tension. "Hayes, what's going on?" Hayes didn't let go of Thornton's wrist. "This individual matches the description from the alert. He's refusing to comply with screening procedures." Vega looked at Thornton, then at the credentials still hanging around his neck. She stepped closer, examining the badge. Her face went pale. "Hayes, that's a DHS executive credential. Let him go. Right now." Hayes hesitated, then tightened his grip. "I received an alert about a suspicious black male." Vega's voice turned cold. "Let him go." "That is Deputy Director Thornton, Office of Intelligence and Analysis. He's senior DHS leadership. Should federal law require TSA to verify credentials before making arrests of anyone displaying federal identification? Let me know what you think." Hayes finally released Thornton's wrist, but his expression remained defiant. He matched the description. Vega cut him off. "Badge and radio. Security office. Now." She turned to Thornton, her voice professional but shaken. "Director Thornton, I apologize on behalf of TSA. This should never have happened." Thornton rubbed his wrist where Hayes had grabbed him. His voice was measured, but the anger underneath was unmistakable. "Supervisor Vega, I want this documented. I want Officer Hayes' name, badge number, and employment record. I want copies of the alert he claims he received. And I want to know how a TSA officer working under DHS authority doesn't recognize senior DHS credentials. Vega nodded. You'll have everything. Please, come with me to the security office. We'll get this sorted out immediately. Thornton looked at the dozens of travelers watching, recording, witnessing. He looked at Hayes, who stood frozen, finally understanding the magnitude of his mistake. Then Thornton spoke clearly, loudly, making sure everyone could hear. My name is Marcus Thornton. I'm the Deputy Director of the Office of Intelligence and Analysis for the Department of Homeland Security. I was arrested for being black in an airport. This is being recorded. Share it. Patricia Vega had been with TSA for 17 years. She'd worked at 3 major airports, supervised dozens of officers, and seen plenty of mistakes. But she'd never seen an officer attempt to arrest a senior DHS official based on racial profiling. She'd read Hayes' complaint file. She'd signed off on his remedial training. She'd noted concerns about his pattern of behavior. And now, standing in Terminal D with a deputy director demanding accountability, she understood that every warning sign they'd ignored had led to this moment. She escorted Thornton to the TSA security office, a small room behind the checkpoint with desks, filing cabinets, and a wall of security monitors. She pulled Hayes' personnel file. Immediately, she called the TSA Federal Security Director for BWI. She called the DHS Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. And she sent a priority alert to TSA headquarters in Washington. Senior DHS official. Wrongfully detained at BWI. Need immediate guidance. Thornton sat in the office, watching Vega make call after call. His laptop bag sat on the desk in front of him, still unopened. His credentials still hung around his neck. His flight was leaving in 90 minutes, but he wasn't going anywhere until this was documented. Vega hung up her last call and turned to Thornton. Director, I've briefed headquarters. The Federal Security Director is en route. Officer Hayes has been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. I've requested his complete employment record, including all 14 complaints filed against him over 9 years. Thornton's voice was quiet but cutting. 14 complaints in 9 years, and he was still at this checkpoint, still targeting passengers who looked like me. Why? Vega had no answer that wouldn't sound like an excuse. She'd been part of the system that allowed Hayes to continue. She'd signed off on training that clearly didn't work. She'd reviewed complaints and closed them with findings of insufficient evidence, even when the pattern was obvious. She turned back to her computer, pulled up Hayes' personnel file, and began printing everything. Every complaint, every investigation summary, every remedial training certificate, every evaluation. She stacked the papers on the desk in front of Thornton. This is his record. Every incident, every complaint, the pattern you're describing. It's all here. Thornton flipped through the pages, his expression hardening with each one. September 2019. Black businessmen detained for nervous behavior. Complaint sustained. Remedial training assigned. March 2020. Indian family questioned excessively about travel plans. Complaint sustained. Diversity training assigned. November 2020. Hispanic woman subjected to multiple bag searches. Complaint not sustained. Insufficient evidence. June 2021. African couple detained 90 minutes. Complaint not sustained. Officer followed procedures. He looked up at Vega. You knew. TSA knew, and you did nothing. Should TSA officers face automatic termination after wrongful detention of federal officials? Drop your answer. Within 6 hours, the videos had exploded across social media. Multiple angles from different travelers showed the entire confrontation. Hayes demanding Thornton step aside. Thornton displaying his credentials. Hayes grabbing his wrist. Vega intervening. The footage showed everything. Hayes' dismissal of federal identification. Thornton's measured responses. The crowd's outrage. TSA officer arrests DHS Deputy Director at BWI Airport. Homeland Security official detained by his own agency's security. I don't care if you're the director. TSA racial profiling caught on camera. The outrage was immediate and intense. The National Association of Black Law Enforcement Officers issued a statement condemning the incident and demanding Hayes' termination. The American Civil Liberties Union called for a comprehensive audit of TSA's complaint procedures. Members of Congress demanded hearings on racial profiling and airport security. Raymond Hayes' life imploded within 48 hours. He was placed on administrative leave without pay, while TSA's Office of Professional Responsibility launched an investigation. Within a week, the investigation concluded. Hayes had violated multiple TSA policies, ignored training on recognizing federal credentials, and demonstrated a pattern of discriminatory behavior that had been documented but not adequately addressed. Hayes issued a brief statement through an attorney. "I made a mistake in a high-pressure situation. I sincerely apologize to Director Thornton and the traveling public, but the apology came too late and said too little." The videos had shown not a mistake, but a pattern, not a high-pressure situation, but a routine encounter escalated by bias. Marcus Thornton contacted the law firm of Cohen, Milstein, Sellers and Toll 3 days after the incident. The lawsuit, filed in the U.S. District Court for the District of Maryland, named Raymond Hayes, TSA Administrator David Pekoski, and the Department of Homeland Security as defendants. The claims were comprehensive and damning. Unlawful detention in violation of the Fourth Amendment, deprivation of civil rights under color of federal authority, racial profiling and discrimination under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, intentional infliction of emotional distress, failure to train, supervise, and discipline TSA personnel, pattern and practice of tolerating discriminatory conduct. The complaint included Hayes' complete employment record, 14 complaints over 9 years, 10 involving allegations of racial discrimination, 4 sustained complaints that resulted only in remedial training, a pattern that TSA leadership had documented but never meaningfully addressed. The lawsuit included screenshots of Hayes' social media activity, posts that questioned the loyalty of immigrants, expressed skepticism about Black Lives Matter, and shared articles about airport security threats that consistently featured photos of people of color. The Department of Homeland Security's attorneys reviewed the case. They examined the videos, read Hayes' complaint history, reviewed TSA's training protocols and complaint procedures. They reached the same conclusion: indefensible. A senior DHS official wrongfully detained by an officer with 14 complaints who'd been allowed to remain at his post. Federal credentials ignored. Witnesses recording. No legal defense that wouldn't expose the department to even greater liability. The department settled 11 months later. $9.4 million paid to Marcus Thornton. The settlement included additional provisions. TSA would implement a new complaint tracking system that flagged officers after 3 sustained complaints for racial bias. TSA would require supervisors to review body camera footage after every complaint. TSA would create an independent civil rights ombudsman position to review all discrimination allegations. And TSA would conduct a comprehensive audit of complaint procedures at all major airports. Raymond Hayes was terminated 3 weeks after the incident. The termination letter was direct and devastating. Officer Hayes, your employment with the Transportation Security Administration is terminated effective immediately for cause. Your actions on October 18th demonstrated a clear pattern of discriminatory conduct, failure to recognize and respect federal credentials, and disregard for TSA policies on respectful treatment of passengers. This incident, combined with your documented history of 14 complaints over 9 years, 10 involving allegations of racial discrimination, demonstrates that you are unfit to serve in a position of public trust. Your appeal rights are outlined in the attached documentation. Hayes' name was entered into the federal database that tracks terminated security personnel. His 9-year career with TSA ended at age 42, with no prospects for similar federal employment. His union initially attempted to fight the termination, but after reviewing the videos, the complaint history, and the settlement amount, they withdrew the appeal. Hayes never issued another public statement. 6 months after the incident, Marcus Thornton testified before the House Committee on Homeland Security's Subcommittee on Transportation and Maritime Security. His testimony was powerful, measured, and devastating. I'm Deputy Director Marcus Thornton. I've been with the Department of Homeland Security for 18 years. I've overseen counterterrorism operations, briefed cabinet officials, and coordinated intelligence that has prevented attacks most Americans will never know about. I hold a top-secret SCI clearance. I have credentials that grant me access to some of the most secure facilities in the federal government. He paused. On October 18th, I was detained at BWI Airport by a TSA officer working under my department's authority. I was handcuffed, searched, and held for questioning because Officer Raymond Hayes decided I looked suspicious. Not because I did anything suspicious, not because I violated any procedure, but because I'm a black man in a suit at an airport, and in Officer Hayes' mind, that was enough. Another pause. The officer had 14 complaints in 9 years. 14. 10 of those complaints involved allegations of racial profiling. 4 were sustained, meaning TSA investigators found them credible and policy violations had occurred. And Officer Hayes remained at his checkpoint, screening passengers, making decisions about who looks suspicious based on criteria that had nothing to do with actual security threats and everything to do with the color of their skin. His voice strengthened. The department settled my lawsuit for $9.4 million. That's accountability. That's an admission that what happened to me was wrong. But $9.4 million doesn't erase the humiliation of being handcuffed in front of hundreds of travelers. It doesn't restore the dignity of having a TSA officer, my own department's officer, tell me he doesn't care what my credentials say. It doesn't undo the message sent to every black traveler in that terminal. You don't belong here, no matter what you've achieved. He looked directly at the committee members. If this can happen to me, a senior federal official with credentials that literally authorize me to enter secure facilities, what happens to everyone else? What happens to the black businessman trying to catch a flight to a meeting? What happens to the Hispanic family traveling to visit relatives? What happens to every person of color who walks through airport security, knowing they might be stopped, searched, and questioned, not because they've done anything wrong, but because someone decided they look suspicious? The hearing room was silent. 14 complaints in 9 years. That's not bad luck. That's not isolated incidents. That's a pattern. A pattern that TSA documented, reviewed, and allowed to continue until it targeted someone with the resources and platform to fight back. Should TSA officers with 3 or more sustained complaints for racial profiling face mandatory termination? Drop your answer below. This wasn't just about one TSA officer at one airport on one Friday afternoon. This was about a system that documents bias, files reports, assigns training, and then allows the same officers to return to the same checkpoints to repeat the same behavior against different passengers. Raymond Hayes' complaint history told a story his supervisors chose to ignore. 14 complaints over 9 years. 10 involving allegations of racial discrimination. 4 sustained after investigation. Each one ended the same way. Written reprimand, mandatory training, return to duty. The pattern was clear. The documentation was extensive. But TSA treated each incident in isolation, never connecting them into the pattern they obviously formed. Hayes wasn't an outlier. A 2020 analysis by the ACLU found that black passengers were 2.5 times more likely than white passengers to be selected for additional screening at major airports. A 2019 ProPublica investigation documented similar patterns. Passengers with Middle Eastern names flagged at higher rates. Hispanic travelers questioned more aggressively about travel plans. Black families subjected to secondary screenings that white families rarely experienced. The system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed, documenting complaints, processing appeals, assigning training, and sending officers back to checkpoints where they continue profiling passengers based on assumptions that have nothing to do with actual security threats. Raymond Hayes' career is over. That's consequence. The Department of Homeland Security paid $9.4 million. That's accountability. TSA implemented new complaint tracking systems and oversight procedures. That's reform. But money and policy changes don't undo the trauma of being handcuffed in an airport. They don't restore the dignity of having your credentials dismissed. They don't erase the message sent every time a passenger of color is pulled aside for additional screening that a white passenger would never face. The real question is, what changes now? Do federal agencies finally implement automatic review boards after 3 sustained complaints instead of tolerating 14? Do TSA officers finally face consequences that match the severity of their violations? Termination for patterns of discrimination, rather than remedial training that clearly doesn't work. Do we finally acknowledge that airport security procedures, designed to keep us safe, have become tools for profiling passengers based on race, ethnicity, and assumptions about who looks dangerous? Because if we don't fix the system that allowed Raymond Hayes to accumulate 14 complaints over 9 years, if we don't address the culture that treats racial profiling complaints as isolated incidents rather than pattern evidence, then we're just waiting for the next officer, the next checkpoint, the next Marcus Thornton who happens to have the credentials and resources to fight back. And what about everyone else? What about the thousands of travelers who get stopped, searched, questioned, and humiliated, but don't have federal badges, don't have legal teams, don't have platforms to tell their stories? Comment if you believe this should be federal law. Any federal employee with 3 sustained complaints for racial bias faces mandatory termination and permanent disqualification from federal security positions. And if you think these stories need to be told, if you believe accountability starts with awareness and change begins with public pressure, then hit that subscribe button. We're not stopping. We're going to keep exposing these patterns, demanding better, and fighting for a system where your credentials matter more than your skin color. This isn't just about one TSA officer or one DHS official. It's about all of us and the system we're willing to tolerate. One that documents discrimination, files reports, and then allows the same behavior to continue against the next passenger, the next family, the next person who just wants to catch a flight without being treated like a suspect.